kampung in the sense that I'm going to show you some notions about Indonesia from us and for our work here. But I'm also going to show you a few projects of OMA from history to projects that we're currently working on or executing that all relate to the topic of vertical city or vertical village, as we refer to. Mostly in Indonesia, the reference to kampung is obvious. First, I would like to quickly introduce OMA. We are a partnership of 6 partners. We have offices in Rotterdam, which is our headquarters, in Doha, in the Middle East, in Qatar, New York, and Hong Kong and Beijing. We operate in such a way that we're always there where our projects are, because for us the cultural context of a project is extremely important. Related to kind of vertical planning, it's also very important to understand how people live and also how people use spaces within their own cultures, and therefore how you can stack them. We're not only an architectural office, we're also an office that thinks beyond architecture and is very much involved in all kinds of media, research, sustainability issues, but also politics and graphic design. Some of the AMO work of this think tank is related to fashion, to education, or to bigger topics like the sustainability of even continents. Writing is a very important part of our work, and that also means that research is a very important part of our work. And when you are working in this masterclass on vertical kampung projects, I think it's very important to study very carefully not only the context of the project in Indonesia, but also simply what is written about vertical housing, vertical mixed-use buildings, or vertical cities even. To understand how people approach them in different cultures is, I think, key to find a solution for what you are doing currently in the masterclass. OMA's portfolio is worldwide, Europe and Asia. Probably you know the bank building, a vertical building in the center of London. She was working on it. Next. Cornell in America, a horizontal building, and I will also come back to that. And then the Seattle Library, which was one of the first vertical stacks of functionality with space in between that was for the public to use. And the Porto Concert Hall. In Asia, currently our portfolio is 34 projects. The Hong Kong office started in 2009 with 3 projects. So we grew very significantly in the last 4 years. And with that growth also came the understanding of the different societies and the different cultures and the different contexts within Asia, amongst which Indonesia, and I will show some of that work later on. Last year we delivered the CCTV building in Beijing, a project that you probably all know, a project that not only has a vertical dimension but also a horizontal dimension, and therefore formed itself as a loop, which constantly represents the process going on in the building. And a building that we will deliver in 3 weeks from now, the Shenzhen Stock Exchange, a building that is a combination of a vertical and a horizontal part of the city, a very private part and a very public part. And then a project that we're currently building, the biggest theater in Asia, the Taipei Performing Arts Center, will be finished in 2 years from now. So first, when you talk about a vertical kampung, I think you can only do that when you look back in history. And then one of the key things to state is that building always has been horizontal. Until kind of somewhere end of 1800s, all the buildings were maximum 3 stories, or maybe in a very exceptional way 4 stories high, and never higher than that. That of course had to do with gravity, but also had to do with use. There was simply no way of transporting yourself through a higher building than that. This is a very typical way of representing horizontal building by a palace, which always was a very stretched building, and therefore become more or less an icon of the democracy or of the king, and has a lot of stature. Yeah? But also within Indonesia, your traditional houses in Java were also always very horizontal. Functionality was next to each other instead of stacked. And even until the early 1900s, we were still talking about typologies that were mainly oriented horizontally, like Frank Lloyd Wright's prairie houses that you probably all know. There was no pressure on these typology of buildings simply because there was space enough. When verticality became an issue was when space became scarce, and how do you deal with that scarceness? And that's also a question now that Jakarta is facing. You were able to stretch yourself for a very long time, but that's over now. You're stuck in the areas surrounding you, and now you need to think about how can I make a city that is much more vertical compared to horizontal. So from horizontality, you're talking about verticality. A dream of a lot of people started with the Tower of Babel going up to heaven. But there are many reasons why people always like to be challenged to look upwards or vertical. But it only became possible to really think about it with the invention of the elevator, an elevator that could bring people to real heights. That was only done in 1852 by a certain guy that called Otis, still one of the most famous elevator brands. So this is a real key moment, because from this moment on, people could really start thinking about verticality in a total different way, because transport was not only in the horizontal plane anymore, but became vertical. And this is a drawing that was made by a famous American architect of that time, just after the invention of the elevator, which immediately represents the topic that you are doing a masterclass about, namely a vertical kampung, a vertical city or village. An overall structure in which people could have their individual spaces and could live on top of each other, and therefore just utilize a small part of the plane of the city and simply have their own domain up in the air. So from the moment that the elevator was there, people started dreaming on how can we stack things and how can we stack functionality. The book Rem Koolhaas wrote about New York, Delirious New York, is of course a very important part of the work of OMA. It's actually the starting point of OMA, where a lot of things are described about verticality, but also about how that impacts the social domain. Because we are always used to live in between a large group of people with a few people next to you. And in the vertical dimension, that of course totally changed, because you not only have people next to you, you also have people below you and on top of you. And what does that socially mean? How do you connect to that new three-dimensional world? But also, what does status mean in the vertical world? A lot of people still think if you live on the top floor, you dominate what is below you. The social structure changed completely by having this third dimension in the way we live. Yeah. And then another important notion about verticality or a vertical building is that actually all the vertical building that was going on up till the moment of the 1960s was in the United States. In Europe or in Asia, it was simply not a topic. People didn't want to live on top of each other, although they wanted to reach the heaven, but that was it. They didn't think about the built environment in that way. And only in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, it became prominent in Europe. And only in the last 20 years, it's a real topic in Asia. Only since then, people start building vertically here. And strangely enough, most of the vertical building now is here. The United States isn't building that much at height anymore. Europe is also slowing down that development significantly, because they're looking back at the developments of the cities that they went through, and they're looking at how they can improve it and not densify it. But in Asia, that process took now a large flight, and most of the vertical building that happens in the world is here. So for you, a very important topic to really think about. So now some positioning, some of it you probably know better than I do, but it's, I think, important to position Indonesia quickly to also understand the position for your project. Yeah. So, of course, Indonesia is the world's fourth largest population. Something people in the West don't really realize. You are a real force to reckon with. 237 million people. That's a lot. Yeah, and that is really an unbelievable power. Also, the fact that you are dispersed over 17,500 islands means something, because that means something about diversity, and about diversity of culture and diversity of thinking. In the development of the urban world and in the development of architecture, diversity is, of course, an important issue to address. We're not the same. We don't have the same expectations. We don't have the same cultural backgrounds. And in your country, that is very specific. And what can that diversity bring to thinking about a vertical world? And, of course, also the fact that you're the largest Muslim country in the world is a topic that is important. How do you live in a Muslim society? How do the cultural groups mix, the ethnic groups mix within it? A topic that is prominent in many places in the world, but especially in countries like Indonesia. Next one. Your history, I will not dwell on this, but of course Jakarta went through many stages of development, all horizontal till the moment of independence, and then you also started thinking about some verticality. And of course the index of your own stock exchange is also rather vertical, so maybe the development of the GDP of the country is related about thinking of vertical building. You see that in many countries that's the case. Maybe it's an interesting topic to look at in your masterclass. It's not only a social effect, but it is also an economic effect. Yeah. Jakarta itself, very large urban area, the center city already, but also the greater Jakarta. And it's kind of a city that is on position 16 at the list of largest cities in the world. But that is kind of going very fast to the top 10. So realize also that although your city is still very horizontal, it is already one of the biggest and most dense cities in the world. Your growth compared to many cities around you is much higher. There's also still a lot of room of growth. So the base is smaller, but the way you expand upwards is much higher. And then if you look at kind of the area of Jakarta, you can see that now you're starting to be locked in by your borders simply because of the geotechnical circumstances on the outskirts, and you need to kind of think about how can we within this area fill. If you look at the development of the city, this was 1972, which is really still a more or less modest city in a large urban area, but currently it's this, yeah, which is a really tight jacket. Also your transport network, of course, also for vertical development is important to consider. And I don't tell you a secret that most people in the world think that the transport system in Jakarta is a nightmare. It's one of the most congested cities in the world, and because of that you could think about concentration, but you could also think about maybe vertical planning could be a starting point of a development of new transport systems and between vertical points in the city. Yeah? So this is the first time you started thinking about vertical planning. Hotel Indonesia in 1962, done by an American architect. It's more or less the first skyscraper that you planned. Of course, this is the most famous one. You all know it, so I don't need to explain it. It's also my favorite one in this city, and that says something about the development after it. Yeah? And then this is what is currently happening in your skyline, or you could question, is this a skyline? Because it seems to be very unified, it seems to be very similar. And how do you deal with that similarity, and how does verticality can add a dimension of differentiation? Currently it's maybe not the case. It would be interesting to think about that as well. So this is kind of the introduction to sketch a little bit the topic and to give a little bit of my perspective on it for the masterclass. Then I will show you some of our work, and then I will come back in the end with some of our work in Indonesia to illustrate how we work ourselves with that context a little bit. Okay, so the vertical component that started for us in 1986, or for OMA, with the design of the hyper building or the hyper city. That was the first time that we proposed to make a vertical city in Bangkok. Bear with me on the quality of the images because they are photographs of original booklets. This was all before the digital age, so this was all still hand drawings. This was the model that we made for Bangkok. And the idea was to not develop horizontal sprawl, but to kind of bring the horizontal sprawl up to liberate the ground plane for green and to create a city at height, a very concentrated city. Why Bangkok? Bangkok is also a city that has a lot of problems in their transport system, but also has almost no public green or any ground plane that can be used by the people of the city anymore. So the idea was to kind of start early 2000s with a structure that would have 20,000 inhabitants and that over time would grow significantly, so in 200 years to 40,000 people, and then to 90,000, and then to 120,000, all in one large city structure. Which meant that we could liberate, so normally these 120,000 people would kind of use this ground plane. If we would go for structure like this, it would only take that square, and that meant the rest could be public space or could be nature. And this was then the hand drawings made, where you see that housing was implemented also as streets, as vertical transport nodes, and that all the cultural, the media, the universities, and also the shopping were all integrated in a vertical dimension. And here you see that there was a main route that people could take through it. And all the connections that were there were in all the different dimensions and all the different directions. And here you see that actually the elements that we know mainly horizontal in this project were projected of being vertical. So simply a street became a vertical element of transport, and the houses were still connected to it as if it was in the flat plane. This was a very important diagram, kind of stipulating that if you have a 24-hour in a day, how the different elements in that vertical city would be alive. So people would transport from their housing into education and park and restaurant and culture and come back into their housing, but all within the same structure. Here another drawing. Next one. And here a collage image that was made at that time. And the original submission model. Of course, the people in Bangkok thought that OMA became totally crazy. How could you propose something like this? Because that of course doesn't really work. So it became a theoretical model to start a conversation on vertical planning in cities. Similar proposals we did later on in Shanghai and in New York, based on the total same project and the same system, just to start to provoke a dialogue about vertical planning. It's not just an extrusion tower, but it can be much more. It's a social aspect. It is a social planning of a part of a city. However, the people in Bangkok didn't forget about us, and in the end we were able to do something that is more or less a vertical planning element. It's the highest tower in Bangkok that we're currently building. It's at 2/3 of its height currently, and what you see, it's a combination of shopping, a combination of hotels, a combination of short stay places, and a combination of real housing for people. It's located in the CBD area on the flight train. And this was the program bar that we received from the city and the clients. Parking, probably you know that in Bangkok everything is still ruled by the royal family, so they give away the land to the people that want to develop something. So you're always working with government and developer at the same time, which is a very interesting situation. So they asked us to do retail, hotel, apartments, and then of course on the top luxury apartments. And what we did, we took simply the envelope that we were given, and at the top that is cut off because of the planes that land at the airport and they come through here, so you cannot surpass that line. We just cut it off, and then we used the program bar that we received simply as the planning. So you have really the retail, you really have the hotel, you really have the apartments, you really have the sky apartments. And because we said, for us, everybody that uses this building is individual, we started carving out as a spiral so that every floor plate becomes unique and different, and every element of the tower becomes unique and becomes different. And you see here how it works. So this spiral just continues over the tower to make every place different over the planning. So here the hotel units, next one, and then here all the housing apartments that have outdoor spaces on different places. They're single apartments, they're duplex apartments, and they're triple apartments. And here you see that spiral also makes it possible to bring the public space all the way up onto the tower. This is the organization of the plan. All the functionalities, of course, have their own entrances, which are split. A difficult situation when you do vertical planning, you always have to look carefully how you bring the different groups of people through the building in the most efficient way. Next one. And then here you see how it looks from below, from the retail area, and coming up, and you see that all the houses have their own individual way of expressing themselves, going to the top. This is in one of the apartments. Because we go so high, the windows cannot open anymore in a normal situation because the pressure, the air pressure, so the windows simply open up to the top. And here you see an image of the building, how it will be when it's finished. Then a project that we are building currently, and I will also show you pictures of how the situation is simply in our own city, in Rotterdam in the Netherlands. The building is also called the Rotterdam, so it resembles the city, and it is really a vertical city as well. It's right in the heart of the city, on one of the most prominent islands. Of course, Rotterdam is known for its harbor activity, so there's a lot of water. And this is the picture of the site when we were asked to design it. This is Hotel New York. That's a very famous place in the Netherlands because that's where all the big ocean liners would start their journey to America. So people that went to the promised land from Europe got on the ocean liner through Hotel New York and then went on their way to New York. It's now a monument, it's a hotel now really. And this was a very industrial zone. There's almost no vertical planning. And this is the situation now, which is very different. So there are already a lot of vertical towers. This is currently the highest tower in the Netherlands. And then there are all vertical elements around it. And we were asked here to not build the highest tower, but the building in itself will be the biggest building in the Netherlands with the most volume. So it will have the most square meterage in one building. One of the key things for us was to study very carefully what the views were of the different people, the different users at every position in the building and the towers, because it's such a concentrated mass. We wanted to make sure that everybody at all time had clear view to the city and to the water. So if you looked at the building envelope that we got and all the functionalities within that project, from housing to offices to hotel to shopping to restaurants, like really a 24-hour planning, we started shifting these different blocks in such a way that are in the end resulted in a volume with the blocks shifted in such a way that everybody, wherever they are in the building, see the city and the water. And then here you see kind of the vertical planning of it, the public layers, public program, the parking layers, housing, offices, and the hotel. And here you see at ground layout, again, different emphasis for the different functionalities. And then coming up, still united with their cores. And then they start differentiating themselves, creating the views from the apartments, creating the views from the offices in the vertical dimension. And then on the top, separated. This was the submission for the competition. Here a render of the situation. And here the night render that we submitted at the competition moment. And these are pictures I took 2 weeks ago. We were there for partner meeting. And you see now how the building is coming up. So this is one of the old industrial buildings, and the building is now towering above it. Inside of the units, you see always sea and water. And here you see the outside of the building with the different boxes shifted in such a way to create that vertical dimension. And this is on the top floor, the view over the mass. And this is from below, where you see the differentiation of functionality also expressed in the volume. Then maybe the most literal example that OMA ever did about vertical planning of a city is the Renaissance in Dubai. We were asked to plan a piece of desert, because Dubai was simply not developed at that moment of time, for a very large office tower. And we said, we don't know if that program is the right program to celebrate in a city like this, because everything that is vertical is an office tower, and maybe we should kind of really think about other dimensions. So what they were planning to do was to demolish the old city of Dubai, which was a beautiful old Kasbah typology of city, and replace it by all kinds of towers. Luckily now they made this preservation area didn't happen. So we proposed to simply take a piece of that old city, which is horizontal, and to make it vertical. So this was that section of the horizontal city. And then this was the vertical planning of it, simply using the exact same spaces, the streets in between, the streets in the vertical dimension, and then the blocks with the different functionalities. And then this was the architecture that was put to it, which was a very generic architecture, and then at the same time a few moments that were special, where the cultural functions were in the slab. We also worked this dream out in such a way that the structure was defined and was possible. And we also thought it was maybe interesting to see if we could put this slab in such a way in the ground that it could rotate doing 24 hours around its own axis, so that the view from every angle of the city would change within 24 hours. So this was the idea, all these towers that they had planned, and we said, don't plan more office towers, keep a piece of the city as a central focal point, and build it as a very generic slab. And then it could turn in 24 hours around its axis. And then this would be the end image that we presented as the vertical city in Dubai. We also had a dream that when then ever Earth was not existing anymore and people or whatever other creatures came back to Earth to discover what we did before, would found that thing as a preservation. And can you go back one? What is very important to say is that this was a dream, of course, but we were very close to realizing the dream, because the plan was in the end selected, and we planned it out all the way to detailed design, and then the crash in Dubai happened. The only thing that didn't survive was the turning, but the whole project itself was really detailed to detailed design, so it was almost starting construction. We still hope that Dubai revives and that maybe this building can still come back. Then maybe a more realistic example related to your masterclass, not only a dream but something that could simply be done, but also touches upon the issues of vertical planning, is a plan that we also did in the Middle East. My Arabic is not good enough to pronounce this well, so I will not do it, but maybe you guys have a better understanding. This was the master plan that we received. Just kind of a generic grid of blocks done by an architect out of the Middle East. And this was the infrastructure that was related to it in the horizontal plane. And what we did is we started reshuffling that generic grid, and we started creating places in between, because for a human scale you of course need to have places in between buildings that are different, where you can have use. And then after we had that composition, we started injecting the vertical elements, or the cores, and because we injected them, this was the start of the verticality of the plan. And then alongside these cores, we started stacking the areas that we took away from the horizontal plane into a vertical plane, which in the end resulted in this configuration. And here you see an image of the model that was submitted as a response to that very horizontal plan. And our argument was to kind of only create horizontal connections, but also to create a grid of horizontal and vertical connections. The cores were positioned in such a way that they were always at the corners of the blocks, so that one core could serve much more blocks than one. So you didn't need to have many cores, you could only use the cores for a few. Yeah. And then these were all the typologies, so there were cores, there were hotels, there were residential buildings, parking buildings, there was a museum, there were 2 mosques, there's leisure, there's retail, there's education facilities, entertainment, restaurant, and other facilities, all in the same typology of blocks, all with the same organization, horizontal and vertical. And then here you see how in the end that city started stacking up. And here you see the different landscapes proposed on the different blocks to create also. And here some of the residential units, we're talking here about the Kampung residential program. So here you could see that we organized the cores in the corners in such a way that it would stack up and become one unity. Here you see all the different typologies of residential units and all the different types of connections between these units. And again, a picture of the model. That project was in the end not selected, but it led to this. And this is Gillman Heights project in Singapore, which is now almost finished. Probably some of you that visit Singapore from Jakarta have seen it come up. It's in a very important site location within Singapore. But the discussion was how can we make a scheme that also incorporates nature in such a very dense city as Singapore. Also, how could we make a community and not just a building with individuals? And also, how could we learn from some space experience in nature within our building? So the site is 81,000 square meters. We have an FAR of 2.1, so we can build about 170,000 square meters on that site. The typical response would be you make one big building, or you make smaller towers, or you make smaller slabs. But all of that is quite problematic because of the interference. So what can we learn also in a large project of a village? And then we started to create different layers in a vertical situation. First, more dense, and all these areas have a direct relationship with the ground, so therefore their main relationship is close by, so their views in the further away are less important. Then coming up in a lower density, so in the end the highest layer of blocks has the lowest density and has mainly the view out. And then we created a grid of these blocks that always overlapped at 2 points, and that's exactly always the point where the core is. So this core that sometimes connects to the top layer actually can serve 4 blocks on 4 different layers of the project, and therefore it became very efficient for the vertical transport. And then this is the stack of the blocks that you have, all with communities within that are planned in a different way. And then here a closer look. And here the image that we submitted at the time of the competition with a very generic facade, but kind of a lot of views over, a lot of parks at height, and the blocks all directed in such a way that they always had a clear view out. And here the image of the roofscape and the communityscape. And here an image from close by on how these apartments would work. Here a view out from the balconies, and here a flat facade. I unfortunately cannot show you images of the building project at this moment of time, because the developer wants to launch this project to the worldwide press and in the world with one group of pictures when they are ready to do so. So by contract I cannot show you anything else than drawings. But the building is now fully at height. The facades are close to up the 3rd layer, and they are now finalizing the facades of the 4th layer. The interior of the 1st and 2nd layer is finished, and the first inhabitants should move in November of this year. Then maybe the most extreme version of a vertical city that OMA ever planned. It was for Mumbai, the city of Mumbai in India, where we didn't only explore vertical functionality, but also vertical public space, and even the biggest square of India to be at height at almost 300 meters up in the air. This is Mumbai as it is today, with some very historical buildings like the Victorian Palace, and some very quick vertical buildings coming up because of the pressure on the city. And the India Tower that we were supposed to plan was right in the heart of the beach. A very tiny site, really very small, 9,000 square meters only. And we were asked to do on that 9,000 square meters, this is already existing, 3 towers. So the question was, can you please do 3 towers on it? And this is the program bar. luxury apartments, lease apartments, guest apartments, food and beverage, retail, hotel, parking, really a city. And we said, let's do it not in 3 towers, let's do just one very, very tall one, and create a place in the city which is Hillcourt, the Sky Lobby, which would be simply a plaza at height, and create an site that was mainly dominated to housing, and a top site that would have the other functionalities. Because of that, we would create much more space surrounding the tower and much more public space at the lower place. And then this was the image that we submitted. We won this competition. Unfortunately, the developer that was going to build this building wasn't playing by the rules and ended up in jail. So the building is never going to be built, to our great frustration. All the floor plans of the building, so from very small coming up to the center where it became the plaza, and then going back to very small at the top again. And this was then the vertical orientation, lifts to here, lifts up in the same shaft because they would transfer, and then kind of the public functionalities with the retail, the plaza, and all the F&B facilities around the heart, all the housing at the bottom, all the hotel and top housing at the top. And here you see how that would look if you were to be at street level. The vertical transportation is of course extremely important to kind of pay a lot of attention to. When you would arrive, the footprint would really be very small. And then you have the lobby with retail and then all the apartments. The apartments would all be very much the same. So you had the central core and then you had apartments in different sizes, but always with the view out and no connection to the neighbor. So you would never look into the next building. And this would then be the view over Mumbai from your apartment. Then the center area, as I already said, an open plaza at height with all the retail and F&B facilities surrounding it. Almost like a public square inside the building. And here a view when you approach it. And then above it, the functionalities, supporting functionalities, and the hotel. The hotel was standard suites, the small rooms, and then, of course, the larger suites. Again, overlooking the city. And then in the top, the luxury apartments and the penthouses, which could take sometimes even a full floor. And this then the night view, liberating everything that where the city is already and adding a layer on top of it. Then a project in New York, 22nd Street. A project that started building already, but then through the economic crisis in the United States got stopped. We still hope that when it goes up, it comes back. It is a very small site. Next one. In between 2 buildings, only 33 feet tall. And then we could go above the historical building, we could gain air rights and could build above it. It would kind of have the Madison Tower in its full view. But because this is the Madison Park, which is extremely important, we wanted to create good views to that park, also from our tower, although it was blocked by this one. So what we did is we shifted the top to kind of look next to the tower, and we shaped the base to address the air rights that we had above this tower. And then this was the shape. So very much the same as any New York tower, but The only thing, it has a very small base and it becomes bigger when it goes up and then smaller again to be able to avoid the Madison Tower. Here you see the model where you see the project become visible at height behind the Madison Tower, and here you see how it avoid that structure. Here a render of the project. And here at the base, of course we could not do anything at that base because it was only 33 feet. So it had a lobby of 4 floors height, and then the swimming pool for the apartments was above that with a glass floor. So you could see the people swim when you entered in the lobby. And then here is the swimming pool, and then from there it started having apartments going above the other buildings. So the first apartments were very long and not with a lot of width, and then the apartments coming up became wider and less deep. And then in the end, they were in their full width. Here you saw some of the very schematic images. This was the 11th floor, and then here the 22nd floor, which was a duplex apartment on the top on the 15th. And then again, a project. So this was already on sale. The sales units was built, and then this happened. So unfortunately, we predicted with our own building the failure of it. And we still hope from a different angle that at a certain moment this happens again and the building will be realized. Another example in New York, but then opposite, not on Manhattan, but with a strong connection to Manhattan. Here on 111 Street, where the connection with Manhattan and the different important projects that are currently realized is clear. The site is a full block, and this was the master plan that we received, what we should do. Then this was the program of that, retail lobbies, gallery, parking, artist studios, hotel, and apartments. And again, we started with a very mathematical approach. We started laying out these different spaces and their requirements. We actually figured out that all would fit in 73, 68, and 86 inches. And then we started laying out these different elements through these different dimensions into different blocks. And we just put these blocks on top of each other as the proposal for the vertical city. So you would be able to have a city at grade, which would just address the street, then an element that would be for public use, then an element which would be for paid use, and then an element that was used for private use. You would buy your apartment. And here you see how that would fit in within the rest of the skyline of New York. And this was then the functional section over the tower. Real vertical planning in every dimension, but also a horizontal planning in the other. This is the model. And here an image that was presented. So that building would be simply here between all the vertical lines. And we had hoped that it would become kind of a beacon that is totally different than the other shapes. Also, when you approach it, it becomes much more prominent at base, but then the top becomes a kind of a sky, very unstable. And then when you're almost there, you almost don't notice it anymore. And when you're below it, you only will notice its plinth and not the building itself. That building is also on hold at this moment of time. So then another Asian proposal. A proposal that we did just 2 years ago for a project on the Bund in Shanghai. Shanghai is a very strange city. It has a very vertical history, It has an extreme, horizontal history, an extreme vertical expression currently in its CBD, and we were asked to plan something that is a little bit in between. But it is also something that is on the Bund, which is the river, most important. Then on the other side is the CBD area, and here is the old city, which is an historic old city with tiny, tiny houses, sometimes 1 or 2 layers only. So how do you address that scale difference in a almost square kilometer between like the tiniest house and the most vertical building you could imagine in Asia? Firstly, we looked at the connections that we need to keep to not cut off the original city from the Bund itself, because that relationship is of course historic and important. And then we looked at how can we address that extreme scale difference of 10 meters of the historical city and 632 meters of the CBD. And we only could be in between. So what we tried to do is make a proposal that had all the different scales and answered to the large scale and the small scale, almost like how they get stone out of a mine. And so we proposed elements that are addressing the height of the proposal, elements that addressing the ground, and also this was done on purpose because from a very large distance it looked as if it addressed the vertical moments in the city and the distance between them, but from close by it created the possibility to have the connection with the Bund for the city still and the full view to the skyline without interrupting. So more or less it framed both the small scale and the large scale, and everything in between became the mass. And so from the old city you would still be able to look out, and from the water you would still see it as a one composite block, one vertical city. It had many different elements that were all oriented in different blocks and scales. We did also a bit an alternative proposal because we thought there was too little of social housing. And this was then an image of the overall proposal. And here you see how it addresses some of the small scale, the view out, and some of the large scale on both sides of the river. That project was won, but then is not going to be built because the developer that bought that piece of land, which was the most expensive piece of land of China at that moment of time, didn't have the finances anymore to pay his second payment on the land, and therefore the government simply took back the land and said thank you for the first payment, but now the land is ours again. So it is now going to be 6 different plots by different developers. Now I was asked also to speak a little bit about our Indonesian projects. I cannot say too much about them because we're doing 4 projects. 3 of them are still extremely confidential. This one is a confidential project, but is a bit a theoretical project, and it's a project that is going to happen in Bali, where we are asked to look at a resort, which is obviously in Bali very much a prominent program, but also to create a place for cultural events and a platform that could be used by the people of Bali themselves. It's a very vertical or a very horizontal project, and I'm only going to give you a few hints of what it's going to be. The first one is this. It's going to be a plateau or a platform, and behind this is an image of it, and hopefully within a few months from now you will be able to see it, because we are very proud of the end result. And this is another image of the model, and I'm not going to tell you which part of the model, but if you can have a little bit imagination, you know. If you know people in Andra Martin's office, maybe you should pressure them a little bit to tell you more, because we're working on this project together with Andra. Then the only project I can show you is actually a very relevant project for where you are, namely it's opposite the street. It's the SSI Towers next to the Gramilia Hotel, which is a competition that we won last year summer, and it's of course a very vertical project. It's in this proposal 160 meters high, and it's a twin tower proposal. So we are currently here, you know all the location because we are sitting there, so it is there, right at the corner of the Golden Triangle, which is the triangle where most high buildings in Jakarta are located. The parameters of the project is we have a height limit of 160 meters, a building coverage of 50, a green coverage of 20, and the hotel that is there takes about half of all of that. So we have very little space left to build two quite large towers. We made many proposals to solve it. And in the end, we came to the conclusion that we need to build two office towers, one for SSI and one for somebody else, retail and function hall that connects to the hotel. And we simply had to overlap the different program elements to be able to fit it on the site. So we created three different program bars, one for the hotel, one for the office tower of SSI with other hotel functions like the meeting rooms and the function hall, and then one full office tower with retail in it. And we simply connected them in such a way that there is a possibility to liberate the ground plane from program, because I think in Indonesia the ground plane is a very important topic. Not only for safety reasons, but you are not capable of entering any of the plots just by wandering around, because there is a big fence or a big barrier or even a bomb check system to allow you or to prevent you to go in. And this client really wants to have a public canvas at the bottom. So what we did, very simple, we took the two towers, the podium with the function hall and the retail. We lifted the retail up, we stretched out the function hall from the hotel, then we skewed the tower in such a way that point versus point, so the distance between the towers should not be 30 meters, but by code only 15 meters. And because of doing that, we were able to create the full program on the site. And this was then the render that we delivered. A lot of people ask me, why did you give it these colors? Why gold and why silver? And the standard answer to that is, if you look at your skyline currently, it's a glass skyline, but because of the high sun that you have, it's also a very reflective glass skyline with only green and blue reflecting buildings. I'm not sure about you, but I don't think it's very exciting, because of that everything looks the same. There is no real difference, and none of the buildings actually stand out because they all have to use the same material simply because of the UV protection films in them. So here we said, let's forget about the UV films. We put other solar protection in place, namely louvers on the outside, and that form the facade, and also give the color, so golden louvers and silver louvers. So if you build up the project, entrance of one tower, entrance of the second, the function hall directly connected to the hotel. And then the plane, the area where you could walk over the site next to the function hall and going in with the escalators into the shopping area. Here the function hall itself. And here then a view of the shopping mall that stretches out over the function hall. The free plane so that you can cross the street. And then the retail that is giving this scale shape inside of the shopping mall. And on the outside you can also come out. And then the two towers on top. inside of the lobby of the towers, and then inside of the shopping mall, or in the offices themselves, with the louvers passing by. The silver tower. The section. I already explained that I wanted to have a bit more color. If it's gold or going to be silver is not the case, but we also wanted to express the facade in a different way than purely horizontal or purely vertical, which is normal. And what we did is we actually made sure that we had sun diagrams. And these sun diagrams showed us actually with the angle of the sun in Jakarta, it's never going to hit horizontal, it's never going to hit vertical, it's always going to hit under an angle. So a louver that is attached to the building under an angle is really capable of protecting the inside better. So we used that sun diagram, we made it a bit more rational, and then every field of this diagram was filled with louvers that were under the diagonal needed from the sun diagram and with the density needed with the amount of sun that hit the building. And so therefore you see in the overall atmosphere of the building that the density of the louvers change by zones, and therefore the building itself is never one skin, while it looks as if it is always the same. So here you see it again, different zones of densities in the vertical dimension. That was it. This building might never be built. That is the news that we received recently. But not because we are fired or that we had a great, crazy idea. But the regulations in Jakarta are changing, and for this plot, that actually means that there is going to be more freedom to plan something on this building. And they're now asking us to look at a building or a vertical constellation of buildings that is much more vertical and therefore much higher. This was 160 meters, and they're asking us now to look at also the possibility to enlarge it above the 200 meters. So maybe even the highest possible in Jakarta. So we're looking at how we can keep some of these ideas, but also addressing more verticality because of the changing regulations of the city. And that was what I had to say. Thank you and good luck with your masterclass. I hope this helps you a little bit with finding a solution for the problem that you're looking into.